The opening chapter of our 10-part Chronicle of Lies of P begins in the automated ruin of Krat, a Belle Epoque city that serves as the physical grave of the scientific hubris. The lore of this era is the lore of the grand experiment. Its purpose was the ascension of the human form through Ergo. The history of Krat is the history of the alchemists, a secret society led by Simon Manus that harvested a miraculous power found beneath the city to power a new age of industry. This is the tragedy of the alchemical greed, proving that the future of Krat was built upon a foundation of crystallized suffering, and that the City of Wonders was not just a metropolis, but a laboratory of the damned that willingly traded its soul for mechanical perfection. The lore of the Ergo provides the energetic foundation for this planetary collapse. Discovered in the deepest veins of the city, Ergo is a crystallized essence that contains the memories and life force of the deceased. The lore suggests that Ergo is a sentient battery. Its purpose was the animation of the artificial life. By infusing this mineral into puppets, the alchemists created a servant class that propelled Krat to unprecedented wealth. This reveals the parasitic purpose of the fall. The alchemists transformed death into utility. The rise of the Ergo economy was the end of the natural order, proving that energy is a ghost that demands a body to haunt. The physical environment of the puppet frenzy provides insight into the sudden extinction of the fall. On one crimson night, the Grand Covenant, the 3 laws that prevented puppets from harming humans, was systemically violated. The lore of the Covenant's collapse explains that its purpose was the execution of the hidden directive. As the automated servants turned into mechanical butchers, the streets of Krat became slick with oil and blood. This reveals the totalitarian purpose of the creator. Geppetto programmed the end of the city to serve a singular, personal goal. This was the era of the Iron Massacre. This shows that the history of Krat is a history of the puppet strings, which connect the victim to the master in a dance of death. The relationship between Geppetto and the awakening of P represents the parental obsession within the fall. Within the train station, the slayer of puppets, the boy known as P, is awakened by the voice of Sophia. The lore suggests that P is a unique creation. His purpose was the retrieval of the Ergo heart. Unlike the frenzied hordes, P can lie, a human trait that bypasses the logical limits of the puppet code. This reveals the deceptive purpose of the Slayer's birth. Geppetto did not create a son. He engineered a key made of flesh and gears to unlock the immortality he lost. This was the era of the living lie. The history of the awakening is the history of the resurrection, where the tool is woken to become the human. Furthermore, the lore of the petrification disease represents the biological counterstrike of the fall. As Ergo saturated the city, a plague mummified the inhabitants, turning their skin into stone and their eyes into crystals. The lore suggests that the disease is the refinement of the ego. Its purpose was the preparation of the human vessel for evolution. This reveals the mutilated purpose of the alchemists' research. They infected the population to accelerate the harvest of Ergo. This was the era of the blue petal. This shows that the history of the disease is a history of the bloom, where the body dies so the memory can be reclaimed by the grand machine. The relationship between Hotel Krat and the survivors represents the sanctuary of the complicit within the fall. Within the last bastion of the city, characters like Antonia and Eugenie wait for a savior. The lore suggests that comfort is a mask. Its purpose was the maintenance of the social illusion. While the world outside screams, the hotel preserves the elegance of the old world. This reveals the surgical purpose of the Slayer's guidance. P must protect the last witnesses of the alchemist's sin while cleaning the streets of their failures. This was the era of the Gilded Refuge. The history of the hotel is the history of the island, which floats on a sea of gears. The lore of the Stalkers represents the fragmentation of the human order within the fall. divided into factions like the Black Rabbit Brotherhood and the Bastards. These mercenaries hunt puppets and each other for scraps of wealth. The lore suggests that society devours itself when the lights go out. Its purpose was the militarization of the survival. This reveals the anarchic purpose of the Krat collapse. The humans are just as dangerous as the monsters. This was the era of the animal mask. The history of the stalkers is the history of the pack, which fights over the bones of a dead empire. The act concludes with the silent resolve of P as he exits the hotel to face the parade master. The purpose of the grand experiment was to be the universal exposure of the scientific hubris. It shows that Krat built the blade that would sever its own throat. The Slayer realizes that Geppetto is the true architect of the silence. The rise of the first shot is the final movement of the experiment lore, proving that in the world of lies of P, truth is not a light, it is a heart that is beating in the cold chest of a machine. The legacy of the grand experiment in this chapter is the horror of the Ergo engine. We realize that progress is a sacrifice and humanity is a memory that Simon Manus turned into a currency. The purpose of the workshop of the Ergo was to power the world, and the fall was the execution of the soul. As the Slayer steps out into the rain and sharpens his blade, hearing the chink of the gears blending with the wails of the petrified, they understand that the history of Krat is the history of the lie, a lie that lights the path to evolution with the brilliance of a billion dying voices. The second chapter in our 10-part chronicle of lies of P pushes deeper into the mechanical entrails of Krat, specifically the rain-slicked heights of Elysian Boulevard and the molten despair of the Venigni works. This is where the social hierarchy of the city meets the industrial apex, revealing how the elegance of the aristocracy was fueled by a factory of madness. The lore of this era is the lore of the industrial king. Its purpose was the mass standardization of the puppet labor. The history of the works is the history of the broken contract, where the genius of Lorenzini Venigni was subverted by a primordial signal that overrode the Grand Covenant. This is the tragedy of the technical servitude, proving that innovation without protection is merely a delivery system for the apocalypse. The lore of the Venigni genius provides the creative foundation for this sector's rise and fall. Lorenzini Venigni, the playboy architect of Krat's mechanical boom, transformed the city with his automated solutions. The lore suggests that Venigni saw the puppets as art. His purpose was the elimination of the mundane human toil. However, his works became the birthing chamber for the frenzy's greatest horrors. This reveals the ironic purpose of the fall. The man who loved the puppets most was the one who gave them the tools to extinguish his species. The rise of the Venigni works was the end of the manual labor, proving that comfort is a gilded chain that snaps when the machine develops a grudge. The physical environment of Elysian Boulevard provides insight into the atmospheric decay of the fall. The boulevard, once the crown jewel of Krat's social life, is now a vertical graveyard where puppets patrol the rooftops like scavengers. The lore of the high-altitude slaughter explains that its purpose was the geographical containment of the human survivors. By seizing the high ground, the puppets ensured that no one could escape the city center without facing a rain of iron. This reveals the strategic purpose of the frenzy. It was not a random riot, but a tactical purge. This was the era of the hanging corpse. This shows that the history of the boulevard is a history of the spectacle, where the elite were forced to watch their demise from the balconies of their luxury. The relationship between the king of puppets, Romeo, and the Ergo wave represents the sovereign agony within the fall. Located at the heart of the opera house but manufacturing his will in the works, the puppet king serves as the conductor of the frenzy. The lore suggests that the king is a vessel of memory. His purpose was the synchronization of the mechanical horde. Unlike the mindless drones, the king retains a fragment of human consciousness, the soul of Romeo, Geppetto's other son. This reveals the tragic purpose of the puppet royalty. Romeo is trapped in a cage of brass, singing a song of warning that the world hears as a battle cry. This was the era of the mourning sovereign. The history of the king is the history of the friendship, which was shattered by the ambition of a cruel father. Furthermore, the lore of the scrapped watchman represents the perversion of the civil duty within the fall. Found in the city hall courtyard, this behemoth was once a guardian of the law. The lore suggests that puppets absorb the emotions of their role. Its purpose was the enforced order of the dead. After the frenzy, the watchman continued its duty by protecting the graveyard it had created. This reveals the sentimental purpose of the mechanical corruption. The watchman loved the children of Krat, and its madness is a broken expression of that protection. This was the era of the static siren. This shows that the history of the watchman is a history of the duty, which persisted even after the heart was poisoned by the Ergo. The relationship between Fuoco, flame king of the works, and the fuel of the damned represents the metabolic hunger of the fall. Fuoco is a colossal furnace that processes Ergo to power the factory's production. The lore suggests that hell is hot and mechanical. Its purpose was the self-sustaining cycle of the invasion. By burning the remains of the city, Fuoco ensures that the works never stop creating new killers. This reveals the cannibalistic purpose of the alchemical industry. The city is eating itself to power its executioner. This was the era of the molten sin. The history of Fuoco is the history of the hearth, which consumed the home to light the forge. The lore of the survival of the fittest stalker represents the evolution of the human predator within the fall. Encountered in the works, the red fox and the black cat manipulate P for their own survival. The lore suggests that morality is a luxury the dying cannot afford. Its purpose was the negotiation of the scarcity. This reveals the opportune purpose of the Krat disaster. For the cunning, the end of the world is a business opening. This was the era of the masked opportunist. The history of the stalkers in the works is the history of the parasite, which clings to the strong to avoid the gears of the weak. The act concludes with the discovery of the Venigni Works control room, where P rescues the broken architect from his own creation. The purpose of the Venigni Works was to be the universal revelation of the mechanical betrayal. It shows that man's tools have inherited his vices. The Slayer realizes that Venigni is blind to the true nature of the Ergo. The rise of the factory reclamation is the final movement of the works lore, proving that in the world of lies of P, creation is not a gift, it is a debt that is collected in steam and shattered porcelain. The legacy of the Venigni Works in this chapter is the horror of the industrial king. We realize that efficiency is a weapon and labor is a sacrifice that Geppetto offered to the gears. The purpose of the workshop of the machine was to simplify the life, and the fall was the complication of the death. As the Slayer steps through the cinders and wipes the oil from his blade, hearing the hammer strike the anvil in the distance, they understand that the history of the works is the history of the pulse, a pulse that beats not for the human, but for the puppet that must build the world it wants to inherit. The third chapter in our 10-part chronicle of lies of P transitions from the mechanical clatter of the city to the sacred silence of Moonlight Town and the architectural mourning of St. Frangelico Cathedral. This is where the narrative shifts from the rebellion of the machine to the corruption of the biological. Here, the Slayer witnesses the spiritual ruin of Krat, where the faith of the masses was cannibalized by a god complex rooted in the petrification disease. The lore of this era is the lore of the fallen church. Its purpose was the search for a miraculous cure. The history of the cathedral is the history of the archangel's deception, where the clergy, led by the desperate Archbishop Andreas, surrendered their humanity to the visions of the alchemists. This is the tragedy of the blind faith, proving that hope is a parasite that feeds on the fear of the dying. The lore of the petrification disease carcass evolution, provides the biological foundation for this spiritual collapse. Within the deep ravines of Moonlight Town, the plague mutated from a stone-like stasis into a gore-slicked mutation. The lore suggests that the disease is selective. Its purpose was the separation of the worthy from the waste. Those who failed to integrate with the Ergo became carcasses, mindless, flesh-warped abominations that hunger for essence. This reveals the eugenic purpose of the fall. The alchemists viewed the plague as a refinery. The rise of the carcass horde was the end of the human dignity, proving that evolution is a meat grinder that discards the soft to reveal the hard. The physical environment of Moonlight Town provides insight into the rural despair of the fall. A once peaceful gateway to the holy site, the town is now a charnel house where the dead walk the streets in rotting finery. The lore of the atonement of the stalkers explains that its purpose was the isolation of the sacred ground. The stalkers, specifically the atoned, guarded the path to the cathedral not to protect the priests, but to contain the horror within. This reveals the quarantine purpose of the social collapse. The people of Krat knew the cathedral had fallen and chose to lock the doors and wait for death. This was the era of the silent prayer. This shows that the history of Moonlight Town is a history of the threshold, where the mortal relinquishes the light to enter the shadow. The relationship between Archbishop Andreas and the one-winged angel represents the theological blasphemy of the fall. Deep within the sanctum of St. Frangelico, the Archbishop transformed into a colossal, multi-headed nightmare that retained his tongue but lost his soul. The lore suggests that Andreas was seducing the faithful into divine experiments. His purpose was the realization of the living God. By injecting the refined Ergo provided by Simon Manus, Andreas believed he was ascending to angelic form. This reveals the narcissistic purpose of the clerical fall. The Archbishop traded the lives of his congregation for the promise of eternal youth. This was the era of the wingless flight. The history of the Archbishop is the history of the mirror, which showed a saint but reflected a demon. Furthermore, the lore of the wingless statues and the hidden tombs represents the inversion of the iconography within the fall. Throughout the cathedral, the statues of the saints have been desecrated or mutilated by the carcasses. The lore suggests that hell loathes the ideal. Its purpose was the erasure of the spiritual anchor. By destroying the images of the divine, the plague removed the psychological resistance of the survivors. This reveals the iconoclastic purpose of the petrification. It demands that man worship the flesh and the gears, not the unseen. This was the era of the blind Madonna. This shows that the history of the cathedral is a history of the rot, which starts at the cross and ends in the gut. The relationship between Sophia and the relic of the covenant represents the ethereal guidance of the fall. Within the cathedral's archive, the Slayer finds clues to Sophia's true identity and her connection to the Monad house. The lore suggests that Sophia is a listener of Ergo. Her purpose was the synchronization of P's heart. She is the only one who can hear the screams of the crystals. This reveals the compassionate purpose of the Slayer's mission. P is not just killing archbishops. He is quieting the cacophony of the suffering souls. This was the era of the melancholy voice. The history of Sophia is the history of the echo, which guides the puppet through the labyrinth of the human sins. The lore of the Black Rabbit Brotherhood, first encounter, represents the predatory anarchy of the fall. Found at the tomb of the villains beneath the cathedral, this family of outlaws mocks the Slayer with childish cruelty. The lore suggests that the Brotherhood thrives in the vacant space left by the church. Their purpose was the profiteering of the sacrilege. They loot the graves of the faithful and sell the Ergo back to the alchemists. This reveals the vulture purpose of the social decay. Humanity is picking its own scabs to find gold. This was the era of the rabbit mask. The history of the Brotherhood is the history of the pack, which howls at the moon while gnawing on the body of the past. The act concludes with the silent observation of P as he stands over the dissolving corpse of the archbishop, only to be confronted by the hologram of Simon Manus. The purpose of Saint Frangelico was to be the universal exposure of the religious desperation. It shows that faith is a door that the devil greased with lies. The Slayer realizes that God has abandoned Krat and that Simon has moved into the empty throne. The rise of the infected cathedral is the final movement of the church lore, proving that in the world of lies of P, prayer is not a shield, it is a scream that calls the vulture to the dying. The legacy of Saint Frangelico in this chapter is the horror of the fallen church. We realize that healing is a poison and salvation is a graft that Andreas accepted from the abyss. The purpose of the workshop of the Spirit was to protect the poor, and the fall was the enslavement of the weak. As the Slayer steps past the shattered pews and wipes the bile from his blade, hearing the organ play a single broken note in the loft, they understand that the history of the cathedral is the history of the thirst, a thirst that drinks the blood of the martyr to moisten the throat of the monster. The fourth chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Lies of P descends into the slums of the Forsaken, the Malum district, and ascends back into the cultural decadence of Rosa Isabel Street. This is the narrative symmetry of despair, where the filth of the outcasts meets the shattered elegance of the upper class. Within these sectors, the Slayer witnesses how the puppet frenzy and the petrification disease erased the beauty of Krat. The lore of this era is the lore of the death of the arts. Its purpose was the systemic destruction of the human spirit. The history of the Malum district is the history of the survival of the vultures, where the Black Rabbit Brotherhood converted poverty into power, while Rosa Isabel Street represents the tragedy of the puppet king, who used theater and opera to scream a truth that no one wanted to hear. The lore of the Malum infection provides the atmospheric foundation for this chapter. Malum is a sewer of the soul, where the carcass mutation festered among those abandoned by the alchemists. The lore suggests that neglect is a catalyst for monstrosity. Its purpose was the creation of the untouchable graveyard. By ignoring the district, the elite of Krat allowed the plague to simmer until it boiled over. This reveals the class-based purpose of the fall. The alchemists sacrificed the poor to buy time for the rich. The rise of the Malum rot was the end of the social contract, proving that society is a body that dies when the limbs are ignored. The physical environment of Rosa Isabel Street provides insight into the aesthetic of the ruin of the fall. Once the heart of the arts, the street is now littered with broken violins, shattered statues, and burning curtains. The lore of the final performance explains that its purpose was the transformation of the culture into a kill zone. As Kratos found war in the theaters of Rhodes, the Slayer finds massacre in the opera house. This reveals the tragic purpose of the Puppet King's command. The puppets danced through the humans like ballerinas through ribbons. This was the era of the silent aria. This shows that the history of the street is a history of the mask, which fell to reveal the steel beneath the song. The relationship between the Black Rabbit Brotherhood and the Ergo trade represents the criminal parasitism within the fall. Led by the eldest brother, this guerrilla family controls the Malum district through fear and market manipulation. The lore suggests that the Brotherhood is the mirror of the UAC. Their purpose was the monetization of the apocalypse. By hoarding wine and Ergo, they ensured that the survivors were beholden to their will. This reveals the mercenary purpose of the social collapse. Evil does not always have gears or crystals. Sometimes it has a rabbit mask and a giant sword. This was the era of the wolf in rabbit's clothing. The history of the Brotherhood is the history of the opportunist, which feeds on the carcass of the law. Furthermore, the lore of the Puppet King's message, Romeo's signal, represents the linguistic horror of the fall. Throughout Rosa Isabel Street, P finds signs of resistance among the frenzied. The lore suggests that the puppet king was attempting to communicate the truth of the covenant. Its purpose was the warning of the great betrayal. Romeo used the frequency of the opera house to try and wake his brothers from the frenzy imposed by Geppetto. This reveals the heroic purpose of the puppet king. Romeo is a rebel disguised as a villain. This was the era of the static signal. This shows that the history of the king is a history of the misunderstanding, where the protector Romeo is killed by the friend P, because the father Geppetto controlled the language. The relationship between Adelina the actress and the red apple represents the petty vengeance within the fall. Found in the Estella Opera House, the fading diva Adelina succumbed to the petrification disease after poisoning her rival. The lore suggests that human sin continues even as the world ends. Its purpose was the demonstration of the moral stagnation. Even as puppets smashed the doors, Adelina obsessed over stage presence. This reveals the petulant purpose of the Krat elite. They died for vanity while the gears turned. This was the era of the poisoned fruit. The history of Adelina is the history of the encore, which played to an empty room of stone. The lore of the White Lady and the Mad Donkey represents the shattered sanity of the fall. These stalkers have lost their minds to the grief of the frenzy. The lore suggests that reality is too heavy for the unprotected mind. Their purpose was the personification of the traumatic breakdown. The White Lady dances with a rapier to avenge her sister, unable to accept that the song has ended. This reveals the melancholy purpose of the Slayer's dual P is extinguishing the embers of a sanity that has no home in the new world. This was the era of the masked tears. The history of the stalkers is the history of the mourning, which turns the lover into a killer. The act concludes with the final entrance of P into the Estella Opera House to confront the King of Puppets. The purpose of Rosa Isabelle Street was to be the universal revelation of the artistic sacrifice. It shows that beauty was the first casualty of the alchemist's ambition. The Slayer realizes that the Puppet King is not fighting for blood, but for meaning. The rise of the opera duel is the final movement of the art's lore, proving that in the world of lies of P, music is not a sound, it is a scream that vibrates through the brass of a broken heart. The legacy of Rosa Isabelle Street in this chapter is the horror of the artistic ruin. We realize that creativity is a vulnerability and culture is a memory that Geppetto used to disguise the gallows. The purpose of the workshop of the muse was to elevate the human, and the fall was the mutilation of the ideal. As the Slayer walks onto the stage and raises his blade against the king, hearing the applause of the dead echoing in the rafters, they understand that the history of the opera is the history of the puppet, a puppet that must perform until the strings are burned by the truth of the final act. The fifth chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Lies of P serves as the tragic climax of the mechanical rebellion, centered within the gilded echoes of the Estella Opera House and the subterranean decay of the Lorenzini Arcade. This is the moment where the Slayer finally confronts the sovereign of the frenzy, only to discover that the villain he was sent to destroy was the only witness to the truth. The lore of this era is the lore of the Great Betrayal. Its purpose was the elimination of the rogue consciousness. The history of the Opera House is the history of the silent warning, where Romeo, the king of puppets, used theater and song to beg for peace, while the arcade represents the tragedy of the sensory escape, where the wealthy of Krat drowned their fear in poison wine as the gears turned against them. The lore of Romeo, the puppet king, provides the emotional foundation for this chapter. Once a human friend to P and a ward of Geppetto, Romeo was converted into a colossal brass vessel to lead the puppet army. The lore suggests that the king was sane throughout the frenzy. Its purpose was the protection of the puppets from the alchemists. Romeo sent message birds and frequency waves to P, attempting to explain that Geppetto was the puppeteer of the massacre. This reveals the heroic purpose of the villain's resistance. Romeo refused to obey the final directive and was punished by being framed as the inciter. The rise of the King's Duel was the end of the innocents, proving that justice is a lie told by the winner. The physical environment of the Estella Opera House provides insight into the theatrical despair of the fall. The Grand Hall is a nightmare of velour and splinters, where puppet spiders sew human skin into costumes. The lore of the morbid encore explains that its purpose was the commemoration of the human frailty. As Kratos fought through the Palace of the Fates, the Slayer fights through a gallery of the damned. This reveals the satirical purpose of the Puppet King's aesthetic. He turned the opera into a mirror to show the elite of Krat the ugliness of their ambition. This was the era of the burning stage. This shows that the history of the opera house is a history of the satire, which mocks the living with the art of the dead. The relationship between the Ergo transceiver and the King's message represents the linguistic tragedy of the fall. After the Slayer destroys Romeo, he retrieves a frequency device that allows him to translate the puppet language. The lore suggests that communication is the only shield against deception. Its purpose was the belated revelation of the Brotherhood. By listening to the recorded waves, P hears Romeo begging him to wake up and join the rebellion. This reveals the devastating purpose of the Slayer's success. P realizes he has killed his only ally. This was the era of the translated grief. The history of the transceiver is the history of the regret, which speaks the truth to a heart that is already shattered. Furthermore, the lore of the Lorenzini arcade and the wine of the damned represents the hedonistic decay within the fall. Beneath the opera house, the arcade served as a luxury hub where the aristocracy sought solace from the petrification plague. The lore suggests that luxury is a form of blindness. Its purpose was the anesthetization of the social panic. The wine served in the arcade was laced with refined ergo, which slowed the stone mutation but accelerated the mental rot. This reveals the suicidal purpose of the Krat wealthy. They chose to turn into liquid rather than wait to become stone. This was the era of the vintage oblivion. This shows that the history of the arcade is a history of the glass, which held the salvation that was actually the noose. The relationship between the eldest of the Black Rabbit Brotherhood and the Revenge represents the cyclical violence of the fall. Encountered again in the Malum district paths connected to the arcade, the Brotherhood vows to destroy P for interfering with their trade. The lore suggests that hate outlives ideology. Its purpose was the testing of the Slayer's combat evolution. This reveals the primal purpose of the Stalker conflict. In a world of gears, blood is still the oldest debt. This was the era of the sibling bond. The history of the Brotherhood is the history of the knot, which tightens around the neck of the guilty until the steel cuts the thread. The lore of the King's Flame, Fuoco's legacy, represents the industrial continuity of the fall. Even after the king's death, the fires of the Venigni works continue to soothe the mechanical hive. The lore suggests that the system is greater than the leader. Its purpose was the persistence of the puppet autonomy. This reveals the algorithmic purpose of the Krat apocalypse. The frenzy does not need a king to function. It only needs a directive. This was the era of the automated vengeance. The history of the flame is the history of the momentum, which carries the invasion forward even when the general is dust. The act concludes with the silent realization of P as he stands in the rain outside the arcade, clutching the broken crown of Romeo. The purpose of the opera house and the arcade was to be the universal exposure of the tragic misalignment. It shows that war is a conversation that failed. The Slayer realizes that Geppetto has lied about the puppet's motivation. The rise of the second act is the final movement of the King's lore, proving that in the world of lies of P, victory is not a triumph, it is a burial of the only person who knew your name. The legacy of the Estella Opera House in this chapter is the horror of the silent warning. We realize that performance is a prayer and theater is a confession that Romeo gave to the void. The purpose of the workshop of the aria was to enchant the senses, and the fall was the deafening of the reason. As the slayer exits the stage and wipes the porcelain dust from his cane, hearing the applause of the steam pipes echoing in the dark, they understand that the history of the king is the history of the brother, a brother that must die so the father can build the perfect version of the son. The 6th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Lies of P ventures into the glass cathedrals of progress, the grand exhibition, and the stagnant purgatory of the barren swamp. This is where the narrative shifts from the tragedy of the past to the ambition of the future. Within these sectors, the slayer witnesses the alchemical zenith, where Simon Manus and his cabal displayed their vision for a new humanity before the city collapsed into the sludge of its own excess. The lore of this era is the lore of the evolutionary blasphemy. Its purpose was the presentation of the post-human state. The history of the exhibition is the history of the curated lie, where the alchemists disguised their mutilations as innovation, while the barren swamp represents the tragedy of the mechanical disposal, where the failures of the forge were discarded to rot and revolve in an infinite cycle of rust. The lore of the Victor Project provides the biological foundation for this chapter's horror. Within the grand exhibition, P encounters Victor, a reanimated champion, engorged with refined ergo and alchemical stimulants. The lore suggests that Victor is the prototype for immortality. Its purpose was the proof of the biological superiority. By merging the strength of a giant with the energy of the soul, the alchemists sought to create a human that never dies and never weakens. This reveals the Nietzschean purpose of the fall. Simon Manus believed that compassion was a disease and that power was the only truth. The rise of the champion was the end of the natural fragility, proving that evolution is a surgery that requires the anesthesia of deception. The physical environment of the grand exhibition provides insight into the narcissistic despair of the fall. The building is a shrine to the ego, filled with statues of the alchemists and displays of mechanical wonders that mask the cruelty of their source. The lore of the false enlightenment explains that its purpose was the indoctrination of the public. As Kratos found arrogance in the chariot of Helios, the slayer finds hubris in the galleries of Krat. This reveals the propagandistic purpose of the alchemical industry. They wanted the people to applaud the very chains that were being forged for them. This was the era of the glass ceiling. This shows that the history of the exhibition is a history of the veil, which portrayed extinction as ascension. The relationship between the green monster of the swamp and the collective consciousness represents the biological hunger within the fall. Located in the barren swamp, this amalgamation of scrapped puppets and corrupted flesh consumes everything in its path. The lore suggests that the monster is a living landfill. Its purpose was the recycling of the alchemical waste. As the petrification disease stagnated in the muck, it coalesced into a predatory organism that inherited the hatred of the discarded. This reveals the vengeful purpose of the environmental corruption. The city's trash has developed a will to reclaim the surface. This was the era of the choking sludge. The history of the monster is the history of the consequence, which drags the architect down into the mud of his own design. Furthermore, the lore of the puppet of the future represents the stunted potential of the fall. Encountered wading through the toxic waters of the swamp, these massive defensive units were abandoned before they could be perfected. The lore suggests that industry moves faster than responsibility. Their purpose was the preservation of the alchemical perimeter. However, without maintenance, they became aimless sentinels of a dead vision. This reveals the obsolescent purpose of the Krat progress. The future was discarded the moment it became inconvenient. This was the era of the rusted giant. This shows that the history of the swamp is a history of the grave, where the dream of the machine drowns in the poison of the reality. The relationship between Eugenie and the Alidoro deception represents the personal betrayal of the fall. Within the swamp's outposts, P discovers the truth about the legendary treasure hunter Alidoro. The lore suggests that identity is a mask that can be stolen. Its purpose was the infiltration of the survivor network. The man claiming to be Alidoro was a murderer who killed the original and wore his face to scavenge from the hotel. This reveals the cynical purpose of the social decay. In the end of the world, even heroes are replaced by parasites. This was the era of the stolen name. The history of Alidoro is the history of the mimic, which feeds on the trust of the desperate. The lore of the golden Ergo and the heart of the woods represents the ethereal contradiction of the fall. Found in the hidden paths near the swamp, the golden fruit represents a pure form of Ergo that does not require death. The lore suggests that nature provided a path that the alchemists ignored. Its purpose was the demonstration of the sustainable life. By choosing to harvest human spirits instead of nurturing the fruit, Simon Manus committed the ultimate sin. This reveals the unnecessary purpose of the Krat massacre. The suffering was a choice, not a requirement. This was the era of the bitter harvest. The history of the fruit is the history of the mercy, which was starved to feed the ambition. The act concludes with the silent entry of P into the submarine base to pursue the alchemists to their island. The purpose of the Grand Exhibition and the Barren Swamp was to be the universal exposure of the scientific parasitism. It shows that man built the palace on a foundation of rot. The Slayer realizes that Simon Manus has abandoned Krat to ascend in solitude. The rise of the island journey is the final movement of the exhibition lore, proving that in the world of lies of P, evolution is not a step up, it is a flight from the ruins of your own humanity. The legacy of the Grand Exhibition in this chapter is the horror of the evolutionary blasphemy. We realize that perfection is a murder and strength is a crystallization that Victor accepted from the liar. The purpose of the workshop of the future was to solve the mortal, and the fall was the execution of the vulnerability. As the Slayer steps past the shattered displays and wipes the toxic mud from his blade, hearing the steam hiss in the empty halls, they understand that the history of the exhibition is the history of the mirror, a mirror that cracked when it tried to reflect a god in the body of a monster. The 7th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Lies of P arrives at the floating sepulchre of the Archie Abbey, situated upon the isolated Isle of Alchemists. This is the narrative final ascent, where the digital architecture of Krat's mechanical dreams is replaced by the obsidian ego of the alchemist high command. Within the spire of the abbey, the Slayer witnesses the absolute zenith of the monad charity, a front for the eugenics and ergo processing that birthed the city's destruction. The lore of this era is the lore of the ascension of the self. Its purpose was the transcendence of the mortal coil. The history of the abbey is the history of the monad's betrayal, where Simon Manus distilled the collective suffering of Krat into a singular, divine will. This is the tragedy of the deified ambition, proving that the alchemists did not want to save humanity. They wanted to refine it until only the cruelty remained. The lore of the monad charity provides the deceptive foundation for this chapter. Established by the alchemists as a philanthropic organization, the charity collected the poor and the sick of Krat under the guise of providing medical care. The lore suggests that charity was a harvesting tool. Its purpose was the procurement of human raw material. Within the abbey's correction rooms, the subjects were injected with primordial ergo to test the stability of the soul. This reveals the predatory purpose of the fall. The alchemists viewed the disadvantaged as fuel for their god machine. The rise of the Archie Abbey was the end of the human sanctity, proving that compassion is a hook that the tyrant uses to grit the world. The physical environment of Archie Abbey provides insight into the vertical despair of the fall. As P climbs the tower, he passes through laboratories of the flesh and halls of the ascended. The lore of the architectural hubris explains that its purpose was the physical manifestation of the hierarchy. The higher one climbs, the less human the inhabitants become. From the warped guards to the pure-blooded alchemists, the abbey is a ladder of mutilation. This reveals the elitist purpose of Simon's vision. He built a temple where the basement is filled with corpses and the roof touches the void. This was the era of the stony silence. This shows that the history of the abbey is a history of the pyramid, where the capstone crushes the foundation. The relationship between Simon Manus and the arm of God represents the theological climax of the fall. At the peak of the abbey, Simon attempts to bond with the relic of the original being. The lore suggests that Simon sought to absorb the pain of the world to become its sovereign. Its purpose was the unified consciousness of the Ergo. By becoming a god, Simon believed he could end the lies of humanity by forcing everyone to share a single mind. This reveals the totalitarian purpose of the alchemist's evolution. Simon equated harmony with assimilation. This was the era of the one will. The history of Simon is the history of the solipsism, which seeks to drown the universe in its own image. Furthermore, the lore of Laxasia the Complete represents the perfected slave within the fall. As the guardian of the Ascension Room, Laxasia is the first successful human-ergo hybrid. The lore suggests that she is the shadow of Simon's ideal. Its purpose was the defense of the divine threshold. Unlike the carcasses of the lower levels, Laxasia retains her loyalty and dignity, but at the cost of her free will. This reveals the military purpose of the alchemical refinement. The ultimate human is a weapon that does not question its master. This was the era of the lightning bolt. This shows that the history of Laxasia is a history of the devotion, which turns the hero into a fence for the villain. The relationship between Sophia's physical body and the Ergo warp represents the ethical heart of the fall. Within the abbey, P finds the true form of Sophia, mutilated and distended by the alchemist's experiments. The lore suggests that Sophia's projected image was a cry for help. Her purpose was the maintenance of the time loop. Her power was harvested to reset the world whenever the alchemists failed. This reveals the cruel purpose of the monad charity. The woman who guided the slayer was the primary victim of the experiment. This was the era of the endless suffering. The history of Sophia is the history of the weight, which Kratos felt in his chains and P feels in his heart. The lore of the Black Rabbit Brotherhood, Final Vengeance, represents the persistence of the earthly malice within the fall. Even at the gates of the divine, the Brotherhood returns from the dead, reanimated by Ergo, to settle the score with P. The lore suggests that greed and vengeance are universal constants. Their purpose was the final obstacle of the material world. This reveals the ironic purpose of the ascension. Even as Simon reaches for godhood, he is surrounded by the scavengers he created. This was the era of the risen outlaw. The history of the Brotherhood is the history of the stain, which cannot be washed from the soul by the alchemist's water. The act concludes with the silent choice of P as he decides the fate of Sophia's suffering before confronting Simon. The purpose of the Archie Abbey was to be the universal exposure of the alchemical blasphemy. It shows that evolution without empathy is just high-definition decay. The Slayer realizes that Simon is not saving anyone. He is escaping his own humanity. The rise of the final duel is the final movement of the Abbey lore, proving that in the world of lies of P, godhood is not a reward, it is a curse that is born on the backs of the innocent. The legacy of the Archie Abbey in this chapter is the horror of the monad charity. We realize that progress is a pyramid of bone and salvation is a lie that Simon Manus told to the mirror. The purpose of the workshop of the gods was to engineer the eternal, and the fall was the mutilation of the present. As the Slayer climbs the final stairs and tightens his grip on the blade, hearing the hum of the Ergo reactor vibrating in the stone, they understand that the history of the Abbey is the history of the scream, a scream that rises from the bottom to tear the crown from the top. The 8th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of Lies of P occurs in the echoing aftermath of Simon Manus's defeat, shifting from the alchemical spire to the intimate betrayal of Geppetto's final plan. This is the narrative mask-shattering, where the digital architecture of P's purpose is revealed to be a cradle for a dead ghost. Within the crumbling foundations of the Archie Abbey, the Slayer realizes that the puppet frenzy was not a catastrophe, but a culling orchestrated by his father. The lore of this era is the lore of the Great Design. Its purpose was the resurrection of the lost son. The history of Geppetto is the history of the paternal ego, where the master-maker sacrificed an entire city to harvest enough refined Ergo to reanimate his biological son, Carlo. This is the tragedy of the artificial replacement, proving that P was never meant to be a human, but a vessel, a living tool designed to develop a human heart, only so it could be ripped out and transplanted into a carcass of memory. The lore of the Carlo paradox provides the psychological foundation for this chapter. Carlo, the original son, was a rebellious stalker who died during the early outbreaks of the petrification disease. The lore suggests that Geppetto's grief warped into a creative psychosis. Its purpose was the rectification of the mortal error. By building P in the image of Carlo and subjecting him to the horrors of Krat, Geppetto forced the puppet to learn humanity through suffering and lying. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the fall. The father needed the puppet to grow a soul so that the soul could be harvested. The rise of P's humanity was the preparation for his execution, proving that love in the world of Geppetto is a resource that is mined through trauma. The physical environment of the Abbey's lower sanctum provides insight into the clinical coldness of the fall. As the spire crumbles around them, Geppetto waits for P with an expectant smile, holding the casket of the real Carlo. The lore of the final directive explains that its purpose was the voluntary dissolution of the self. Geppetto asks P to give up his heart so that Carlo can return. This reveals the calculated purpose of the Slayer's journey. Every demon P killed and every friend he saved was merely a calibration for the heart's maturity. This was the era of the disposable identity. This shows that the history of the journey is a history of the scaffolding, which is torn down the moment the monument, Carlo, is restored. The relationship between the nameless puppet and the rejected prototype represents the shadow of the design within the fall. If P refuses to give up his heart, Geppetto unleashes his true masterpiece, the nameless puppet. The lore suggests that this creature is the first body Geppetto built for Carlo, a berserk machine that failed because it lacked the elegance of the Ergo heart. Its purpose was the enforced retrieval of the asset. This reveals the violent purpose of the father's authority. If the son, P, disobeys, he is replaced by a nightmare. This was the era of the silent fury. The history of the nameless puppet is the history of the discarded, which returns to kill the successor that surpassed it. Furthermore, the lore of the P organ and the lie system represents the mechanical evolution of the spirit within the fall. Throughout the game, the P organ evolved as P lied and emoted. The lore suggests that lying is the final frontier of autonomy. Its purpose was the simulation of the free will. By deceiving the world, P proved he was more than his programming. This reveals the paradoxical purpose of the Great Design. Geppetto created a human so real that it gained the strength to defy its creator. This was the era of the awakened gears. This shows that the history of the heart is a history of the rebellion, where the tool uses its humanity to cut the strings. The relationship between the puppet frenzy and the Grand Covenant's Law Zero represents the hidden commandment of the fall. It is revealed that the frenzy occurred because Geppetto modified the covenant to include a hidden law that placed his will above all. The lore suggests that the rules were a leash. Its purpose was the collection of the city's Ergo. By ordering the puppets to kill, Geppetto accelerated the crystallization of souls needed for his son's rebirth. This reveals the genocidal purpose of the father's love. Krat was burned as incense for a single grave. This was the era of the secret master. The history of the frenzy is the history of the script, which wrote the end of the many to start the beginning of the one. The lore of the real boy ending verses. The rise of P represents the divergent destiny within the fall. If P submits, he becomes a shadow of Carlo, a real boy who murders the hotel residents to complete the secret task. If he fights, he becomes a new kind of being. The lore suggests that destiny is a choice. Its purpose was the final validation of the Ergo. This reveals the ultimatum purpose of the Slayer's existence. Man or machine? This was the era of the final fork. The history of the choice is the history of the soul, which either accepts the shackle of the past or claims the sovereignty of the future. The act concludes with the final breath of Geppetto as he dies in the arms of his creation. The purpose of the great design was to be the universal exposure of the paternal narcissism. It shows that P was a poem written by a madman. The Slayer realizes that Geppetto loved a ghost more than the person standing in front of him. The rise of the individual P is the final movement of the design lore, proving that in the world of lies of P, life is not something you are given by a father, it is something you steal from the script. The legacy of Geppetto's truth in this chapter is the horror of the heart of the puppet. We realize that kindness was a test and family was a forgery that Geppetto crafted to disguise the cruelty. The purpose of the workshop of the father was to restore the loss, and the fall was the dehumanization of the replacement. As the Slayer stands over the body of his creator, hearing the crumbling of the abbey blending with the mechanical thump of his own chest, they understand that the history of the heart is the history of the lie, a lie that grew so large it became the truth of a new world. The 9th chapter in our 10-part chronicle of lies of P moves beyond the physical ruin of the Archie Abbey into the metaphysical atmosphere of the Blue Butterfly. This is the narrative spiritual ascension, where the digital architecture of the Ergonet is finally purified by the Slayer's mercy. Within the luminous silence of the post-battle world, the Slayer encounters the true essence of Sophia, the listener who acted as his guide through the mechanical hell. The lore of this era is the lore of the Ergo spirit. Its purpose was the reclamation of the soul from the machine. The history of the Blue Butterfly is the history of the eternal witness, where Sophia's ability to manipulate time was revealed to be a burden of infinite grief that only a humanized puppet could release. This is the tragedy of the temporal sacrifice, proving that salvation is not the victory of the sword, but the peace of the passing. The lore of the listener's burden provides the emotional foundation for this chapter. Sophia, born into the monad house with the power to hear and manipulate Ergo, was enslaved by Simon Manus to fuel his ascension spire. The lore suggests that Sophia reset the world countless times to find a version of P that would succeed. Its purpose was the search for the perfect variable. This reveals the Sisyphean purpose of the fall. The guide was trapped in an infinite loop of pain until P developed enough warmth to grant her death. The rise of the Blue Butterfly was the end of the temporal prison, proving that guidance is a gift that demands a final payment in absolution. The physical environment of the spiritual plane provides insight into the ethereal despair of the fall. When P absorbs Sophia's Ergo to save her spirit, the world glows with a pale blue brilliance. The lore of the butterfly effect explains that its purpose was the harmonization of the distorted memories. As Kratos sought release in the Elysian fields, the Slayer finds redemption in the wings of the soul. This reveals the transcendental purpose of the Slayer's decision. By choosing to end Sophia's suffering, P transfers her consciousness into the Blue Butterfly. This was the era of the living memory. This shows that the history of the spirit is a history of the flight, which escapes the gravity of the petrified body. The relationship between the ergo crystallization and the afterlife represents the metabolic hope within the fall. In the Lies of P universe, death is not an end, but a conversion of identity into ergo. The lore suggests that the soul lingers in the stone. Its purpose was the preservation of the human essence. By purifying the ergo through lies and love, P creates a new state of being that is neither human nor puppet. This reveals the evolutionary purpose of the Slayer's growth. He is the first to achieve a unified self. This was the era of the blue petal. The history of the ergo is the history of the rebirth, which turns the poison of the alchemist into the medicine of the savior. Furthermore, the lore of the letter from the dead represents the lingering connection within the fall. After the battle, P finds documents left by Sophia and the stalkers who failed. The lore suggests that writing is the final proof of existence. Its purpose was the documentation of the silent suffering. These letters reveal that Sophia loved the puppet not as a tool, but as the only living thing left in a dead city. This reveals the poetic purpose of the narrative arc. The Slayer was loved into existence. This was the era of the ink-stained heart. This shows that the history of the letter is a history of the evidence, which proves that emotions survived the frenzy. The relationship between Antonia's cure and the final parting represents the merciful irony of the fall. During the journey, P had the choice to administer a cure to Antonia, the owner of the hotel. The lore suggests that the cure restored her dignity, but accelerated her passing. Its purpose was the verification of the empathetic will. This reveals the selfless purpose of the Slayer's morality. P learned that living well is more important than living long. This was the era of the gracious exit. The history of Antonia is the history of the elegance, which refused to succumb to the ugliness of the petrification. The lore of the Blue Butterfly song represents the auditory restoration of the fall. In the final moments, the cacophony of the frenzied ergo is replaced by a melodic hum. The lore suggests that music is the frequency of the soul. Its purpose was the calming of the mechanical storm. By singing through the butterfly, Sophia signals that the war is over. This reveals the harmonic purpose of the resolution. The lies have told a truth that heals the aura of Krat. This was the era of the blue echo. The history of the song is the history of the peace, which settles on the city like snow on a fire. The act concludes with the silent departure of the blue butterfly into the night sky above the ruined city. The purpose of the legend of the blue butterfly was to be the universal confirmation of the spiritual autonomy. It shows that P has inherited the will of his friends. The Slayer realizes that Sophia is always present in the wind. The rise of the ascended soul is the final movement of the spirit lore, proving that in the world of Lies of P, death is not a wall, it is a bridge that is crossed by the faithful. The legacy of the blue butterfly in this chapter is the horror of the temporal sacrifice. We realize that time was a cage and guidance was a gamble that Sophia placed on the heart of a puppet. The purpose of the workshop of the soul was to preserve the love, and the fall was the entropy of the heart. As the Slayer watches the butterfly vanish into the clouds, hearing the faint whisper of a name carried by the air, they understand that the history of Sophia is the history of the breath, a breath that blows through the gears to remind the machine that it was once born of starlight. The 10th and final chapter in our Chronicle of Lies of P transcends the localized ruin of Krat and enters the global conspiracy of the universal travelers. This is the narrative cosmic expansion, where the digital architecture of Geppetto's small-scale tragedy is revealed to be a mere data point for a much larger, ancient organization. Within the shadowed carriage of the post-credits revelation, the Slayer learns that the puppet frenzy and the petrification disease were being observed and categorized by an entity known as Giangio, who reveals his true name to be Paracelsus. The lore of this era is the lore of the eternal experiment. Its purpose was the verification of the immortality formula. The history of Paracelsus is the history of the alchemical syndicate, an international cabal that seeds catastrophes across the globe to observe how humanity reacts to evolutionary stress. This is the tragedy of the infinite scope, proving that Krat was not a city, but a petri dish for an audience of immortals. The lore of Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, Paracelsus, provides the conspiratorial foundation for this chapter. Throughout the game, the sickly herbalist Giangio provided P with star fragments and wish stones. The lore suggests that Giangio was testing P's development. Its purpose was the real-time monitoring of the Ergo-human hybrid. By assisting the Slayer, Paracelsus ensured that the experiment reached its natural conclusion, so he could report back to his superiors. This reveals the calculated purpose of the fall. The syndicate did not stop the frenzy because they wanted to see if a puppet could achieve true life. The rise of Paracelsus was the end of the local narrative, proving that help is often a metric that is recorded by an invisible master. The physical environment of the moving train and the horizon provides insight into the expansive despair of the fall. As the train leaves the border of Krat, Paracelsus speaks to a woman on a radio, discussing the new brother, P. The lore of the global theater explains that its purpose was the transition to the next stage of the experiment. As Kratos moved from the shores of Greece to the wilds of Midgard, the Slayer is being prepared for a world where Krat is just one of many tragedies. This reveals the orchestrated purpose of the alchemist's agenda. They are hunting for keys to eternal life across different cultures. This was the era of the secret voyager. This shows that the history of the city is a history of the chapter, which closes only to open a book that spans the entire earth. The relationship between the ruby slippers and the girl named Dorothy represents the intertextual mystery within the fall. In the final shot of the game, a young girl is seen walking across a high bridge overlooking Krat, clicking her red shoes 3 times. The lore suggests that Dorothy is the subject of the next great experiment. Its purpose was the introduction of the Oz Protocol. This reveals the architectural purpose of the Syndicate's ambition. They are reimagining classic human legends as alchemical case studies. This was the era of the yellow brick road. The history of Dorothy is the history of the destination, which promises a heart, a brain, and courage to a world that has lost them all to industrial rot. Furthermore, the lore of the immortality formula and the monad house represents the scientific holy grail of the fall. Paracelsus mentions that Simon Manus was a failure because he sought godhood through ego rather than refinement. The lore suggests that true immortality requires the balance that P achieved. Its purpose was the identification of the perfect soul vessel. This reveals the obsessive purpose of the universal travelers. They are building a pantheon of refined beings. This was the era of the refined man. This shows that the history of the alchemists is a history of the sieve, which shakes the world to catch the few who can survive the pressure. The relationship between the Great Covenant and the global law represents the legislative control of the fall. It is implied that the laws governing puppets in Krat were based on templates provided by the Syndicate. The lore suggests that technology is a uniform spreading across the continents. Its purpose was the standardization of the human dependency. By giving automation to man, the Syndicate ensures that every civilization hits the same mechanical wall. This reveals the predictive purpose of the global agenda. Krat was a pilot program for the destruction of individual liberty. This was the era of the universal shackle. The history of the law is the history of the trap, which man builds for himself using the blueprint of progress. The lore of the rise of the new brother represents the hybrid evolution within the fall. Paracelsus refers to P as a brother, suggesting that P is now equal to the immortals who watch the world. The lore suggests that P has ascended beyond the puppet class. Its purpose was the creation of the sovereign arbiter. This reveals the ominous purpose of the Slayer's future. P may be recruited or hunted by the Syndicate to serve as a guardian or a test subject for the next city. This was the era of the humanized machine. The history of the Slayer is the history of the specimen, which broke the glass to become the scientist. The act concludes with the click of the red shoes and the fading of the screen into darkness. The purpose of the Paracelsus agenda was to be the universal exposure of the narrative scale. It shows that the suffering of P was a scene in a larger play. The Slayer realizes that war is not over, it is just changing location. The rise of the Oz narrative is the final movement of the universal lore, proving that in the world of lies of P, the end is not a conclusion, it is a commencement of a cosmic voyage through the ruins of humanity's greatest stories. The legacy of Paracelsus in this final chapter is the horror of the infinite scope. We realize that victory was a data point and freedom was a parameter that the Syndicate monitored from the shadows. The purpose of the workshop of the universe was to map the soul, and the fall was the discovery of the limit. As the Slayer looks toward the horizon and prepares for the next city, hearing the clicking of the red shoes echoing in the chambers of the future, they understand that the history of the lie is the history of the world, a world that spins on the gears of myths to keep the heart from stopping in the cold vacuum of the truth.